surprisingly not part of the city walls. It is in fact a wall that was built to go around the Abbey of St Mary, the ruins of which can be seen in the museum gardens. The monks of St Mary's Abbey had to build a defensive wall around the abbey to protect it against the Scots who kept threatening England's second city. It also stopped the locals from seeing what the monks were getting up to inside. The wall was the largest abbey fortification in the country. On the left, behind the bus and the trees, are the buildings of King's Manor. The present-day King's Manor backs onto the ruins of St Mary's Abbey in the museum gardens. It was built in 1270 as the Abbot's Lodging, the home of the Abbot of St Mary's. It is much bigger than when it was first built, after being extended in 1480 and again in 1610. It is said that King's Manor survived the dissolution of the monasteries even though St Mary's Abbey didn't, simply because Henry VIII liked it. The Council of the North, which governed this part of England on behalf of the monarch, was held there until 1641, when the council was abolished. Today, King's Manor is part of York University. Lucky students can get to study archaeology there, but it is still open to the public. As we move across the junction into Gilly Gate, originally called St Giles Gate, on the right-hand side of the bus, just above the shop windows, you will see a black lamp on the wall. Look behind the lamp and you can see a small white cat. You'll see lots of these cats all over the city's buildings. Originally put there as good luck charms in Victorian times, later they became a trademark of a local architect called Tom Adams. These cats have become a feature all over the city. On the right, you can see some of the buildings have bricked-up windows on the first floor. This comes from the Georgian window tax. In 1696, a law was passed on which owners were taxed on the amount of windows their property had. To avoid paying this tax, windows were bricked up. These days, when something is expensive, you'll hear people say, "That's daylight robbery." It is possible this saying comes from the old tax. You either paid up or lost your daylight, hence daylight robbery. On the left, at the end of Gilly Gate, is the former Salvation Army Citadel. It stands on the site where St Giles Church used to stand. It is one of the very few churches in York we know very little about, possibly due to the fact its graveyard was used to bury the bodies of victims of the plague in 1605. It may also have been used for burying the bodies of executed criminals until 1693. Looking ahead on the corner, you can see the award-winning modern extension to the York St John University, formerly a Victorian Anglican teacher training college. It became the College of Ripon York St John before being granted university status in 2006, and it has around 6,000 students. It is one of two universities, the other being York University. This is situated on the eastern outskirts of the city and opened in 1963. It boasts over 15,000 students and is regularly voted into the top 15 universities in the country. In Lord Mayor's Walk, look to the right and we will get a nice view along the city walls. You can still see the defensive moat at the foot of the walls. This once would have been full of filthy water and rotting waste. Behind the wall, to the right, you can see York Minster, or to give it its proper title, the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St Peter in York. It is both a minster and a cathedral. The name Minster derives from the Latin monasterium. From here, the local monks would go out to teach or minister. It is also a cathedral because it contains the throne of a bishop. This is taken from the Latin cathedra and means seat. In York's case, the seat of an archbishop. The present York Minster is the 5th church to be on this site. The first church was just a small wooden chapel put there in 627 AD for the baptism of King Edwin of Northumbria. The central tower has 275 steps to the top, and the views are breathtaking. York Minster also has one of the finest collections of medieval stained glass in the world. The Great East Window is the largest in the Minster and tells the story of the Bible from Genesis through to Revelations. Monk Bar has the only working portcullis on any of York's gateways. A portcullis is a big gate that can be lowered when the city is under threat. The last time it was lowered was in 1953 to celebrate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The gate came down brilliantly, but got stuck when it dug into the road below. It took days to raise it back up, so it's never been dropped down since. We still claim it works, though. Keep looking on your right, and as we turn, you will see Monk Bar, which is the tallest of York's gateways, standing at 63 feet, or 19.2 meters in height. On the top stand life-size stone figures known as the Wild Men of York. Legend says they will come alive and throw their boulders down onto anybody daring enough to attack the city. The stop here is for the Richard III Museum, which is housed inside the gateway. The Richard III Museum tells the story of his life and death. William Shakespeare's play depicts Richard III as a thoroughly bad king who murders his nephews in the Tower of London. But there are many who think that Shakespeare was wrong. Certainly Richard was well thought of in York, and the museum gives both sides of the story. As we leave Monk Bar, look along the street to your right, and set back, you can see the wonderful county hospital, built in 1850, which is now used as apartments. Keep looking to the right, and you can see some older buildings on Monkgate, dating from the 17 and 1800s. Any earlier buildings on this street were destroyed in the Siege of York in 1644. On the left, by the blue road sign, set back behind the railings, is a garden in the style of an Elizabethan knot garden. It was thought to be introduced as a selling feature for what was the design shop next door. It is not very historic, but we think it's very nice and worth pointing out. If we were to follow the road ahead of us across the roundabout for about 10 miles, we would come to Castle Howard, a stately home dating back to about 1700. Castle Howard is where the period drama Brideshead Revisited was filmed. With its elegant house, beautiful gardens and lake, it is well worth a visit. We are moving into Foss Bank and running alongside York's second river, the Foss, on our left. It probably gets its name from the Latin word fossa, which means ditch or stream. There is no longer any commercial river traffic on the Foss, which was made into a canal in 1792. Today, both the Ouse and the Foss are mainly used by pleasure boats and wildlife. Looking to the right is Sainsbury's supermarket. In the 1980s, when this was being built, workmen unearthed hundreds of skeletons here. Work was stopped, and an investigation found this site to be the largest Jewish burial site outside of London, dating back to 1177. The chief rabbi was called in, the land was consecrated and declared sacred, and the bodies were left in peace. This area is known as Dewberry, which means Jewish borough or town. If you look to your right, you will see that the city walls come to an end. That's because a wall was not needed at this side of the city due to the king's fish pool, which formed a man-made defense against attack. This is one of the reasons people think the walls aren't complete. It is because there seems to be sections missing. The walls never completely circled the city, as there was no need for a wall where they met water. There would have been a tower at the end of the wall known as a postern. It was demolished in 1829 to make way for traffic. As we turn onto Peasholm Green, on our right is St Cuthbert's Church. The church is mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, the book in which William the Conqueror listed all of the property and land he took over when he invaded, so he could tax the locals. Notice the church has two doors, a large door with a porch to the left-hand end and a smaller door to the right-hand end. The small door is Saxon times. If you look to the left, there is a 15th century timber-framed house, now the Black Swan pub. The Black Swan claims to be one of the most haunted pubs in York, but to be fair, most pubs in York claim to be either the most haunted or the oldest. It does have some rather intriguing ghosts in there though. It has a grumpy old man who sits at the bar, but nobody ever buys him a drink. A young lady sits looking into the fire, but nobody has ever seen her face. And a pair of legs which run around, bringing a whole new meaning to the phrase, getting legless in a pub. This brings us into Stonebow. This is our nearest stop for York's most famous street, the Shambles, the medieval cobbled street of the butchers, the market, the city centre shops, and the Merchant Adventurers Hall. Please alight here for any of these places. Looking ahead, we can see the small church hall of St Crux. Just in front of St Crux on the right is York's shortest street with the longest name, Whitma Watma Gate. We think it gets its name from a corruption of an old Saxon saying, Whitna Watna, meaning it's neither one thing nor the other. The street only has 3 properties, numbers 1, 1A, and 1.5. It never gets to 2. Just past the church hall of St Crux on the right is the Shambles, York's most photographed street. The Shambles probably gets its name from an old Danish word, fleshamels, which means the street of the butchers. The flesh was the meat, and the shamel was a large window ledge outside the shop where meat would be displayed. Looking ahead is the Church of All Saints pavement, which has a beautiful lantern tower instead of a spire. In medieval times, a fire used to be lit in the top of the tower in order to guide travellers safely back to the city. There was no street lighting then, and so York was not as easy to find after dark as it is today. Also, York was surrounded by a great forest, the Forest of Gull Trees. It was dangerous to be lost. we move into Coppergate. It doesn't get its name from the metal copper as you might think, but from cupra, the Norse word for cup maker. It was when the new Coppergate shopping precinct was being built in the late 1970s and early 1980s that over 40,000 finds from a Viking settlement were unearthed, beautifully preserved by the silt and mud around here. What was found here was so important that it even changed the way we teach about Vikings in the National School curriculum. Today you can see what was found in the Jorvik Viking Centre, where you can travel back in time over 1,000 years in York's history to experience the sights, the sounds and even the smells of Viking York. You can visit the Viking Centre from our next stop, but please remain seated until we arrive at the Clifford's Tower stop. We are now moving into Tower Street and the site of the castle. This is your stop for the Castle Museum, Clifford's Tower, York Boat River Cruises, the Jorvik Viking Centre, York Dungeon, Fairfax House, and St George's Field Coach and Car Park. Clifford's Tower is on our left. It was part of the castle complex that was built in 1245, but it is not the first castle to stand here. Originally, there were two castles, one either side of the river. They were built by William the Conqueror's men in 1068 and made of wood. William didn't have it all his own way in the north, and a year later the locals burnt down the castle in a rebellion. Clifford's Tower is on our left. It was part of the castle complex that was built in 1245, but it is not the first castle to stand here. Originally, there were two castles, one either side of the river. They were built by William the Conqueror's men in 1068 and made of wood. William didn't have it all his own way in the north, and a year later the locals burnt down the castle in a rebellion. William was furious and sent his troops to quell the rebellion. Building on our left. It used to be the Assize Courts. These days it is the Crown Court. As we pass by, you can see the bars on the cell windows. Those on trial here are still held in the same cells the offenders were held in over 200 years ago. This is due to the building being a Grade 1 listed property, so it cannot be altered inside or out. On the left you can see the last remaining section of the castle wall. Look left as we pass the circular drum tower, and you can see where the drawbridge would have been at the base of the wall. Ahead we can see a square tower marking the end of this section of the city wall. This is Fishergate Postern Tower, which stands where the wall met the River Foss, which would have been much wider than it is today. There were 6 postern towers on the walls of York. Postern means rear entrance, and this is the only such tower still remaining. As we turn into Lead Mills Lane, look to the right. On the wall of the tower, just above head height, is a stone projection sticking out. This projection is part of a garderobe, which is a medieval toilet chute. The waste would come out of the chute and drop directly into the King's Fish Pool down below. Over the hedge to our left is the graveyard of St George's Church, which has just one upstanding headstone in it. Those on the bottom deck may see this headstone through the gates on the left as we turn. This is the grave of Dick Turpin, the notorious Georgian highwayman who robbed stagecoaches in the 18th century. On the left is St George's Roman Catholic Church, which was built in 1850 for the Irish settlers who arrived in this area during the Irish potato famine. The church replaced an earlier one and was temporarily the Catholic Cathedral of York. It was designed by the architect Joseph Hanson, who also designed the Hansom cab, a horse-drawn vehicle which was very popular in Victorian times. An example of a Hansom cab can be seen in the Castle Museum. We move into Walmgate. This street was originally called Walbergate, possibly named after a female Viking warrior named Walber. It is one of York's oldest streets, following the line of the ancient Roman road to the east. Looking to the right, you will see a lovely timber-frame building. This is called Rosemorel House and dates back to about 1400. In the 1800s, it was known as Kilmartin's, a lodging house for the poor. It is said that if you couldn't get a bed for the night, they would stretch a length of rope out from one end of the room to the other, and you would sleep hanging over the rope. This was known as a penny lean, and is possibly where we get the saying, "You can sleep on." As we turn right, look to the right, and you will have a brief view inside the Barbican. Imagine being trapped in there, with the soldiers throwing all kinds of nasty things down from above. In 1828, the city's cattle market was relocated to this area. Cattle and sheep were brought here from all over the country to be traded. The flat grassed areas On our left is the Barbican Leisure Centre, which is named after the Barbican at nearby Walmgate Bar. This is where the UK Snooker Championship has been held many times, and it is also a